Welcome back, listeners. I'm very excited because this week we have the fabulous Scarlett St. Clair joining us, who is an incredible paranormal YA author. So thank you so much for joining us, Scarlett.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
And I know you have so much goodness to share with our listeners. But first I want to start off with is, how did you first know that you were a writer?
So I read The Lord of the Rings, and I became obsessed with fantasy worlds and the idea that I could build a world that was different from the one I lived in. And I decided that I wanted to be a writer, and I was just interested in being like, not just a writer, but a world famous author. And I remember like reflecting on that and looking at all of these instances where I was sort of drawn to writing. But I don't think being a novel writer ever clicked, but I would write like short stories and like illustrate them. And I wrote this ridiculous story about princesses and carried it around with me forever. I was obsessed with it. And or just like I would write little things like essays about trees or just practice my handwriting. I always felt drawn to put my like pen to paper. So it made sense when I finally made the connection that I wanted to be a novel writer. And I think it was just the part that was missing was that I could create worlds, that I could be a fantasy author. I could create things outside of what we believe in this world.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is something that I am fascinated by, because you create these beautiful worlds that people feel like you're in them, you can be a part of them, they're real. And to be honest, something fantasy isn't something I've dabbled in, and to be able to create that, I'm absolutely fascinated with, because I love to read it. But what was from that, and from growing up writing stories, etc., when was the moment of like, okay, I'm gonna give this a go and I'm gonna write my first novel?
Oh, like from the age like of 13.
Awesome.
That's when I read The Lord of the Rings. Yeah. Yep. And then when I was 13, I was like, I'm going to write a novel. And, when you're that age, you're uninhibited by the reality of the world. Like ignorance is your best friend then, because you just have no idea about like what lays ahead of you for this journey. And I think sometimes that's the best part of it, is that linger in that ignorance for as long as possible, because I think that's what helps you dream, right? So yeah, from the very beginning, and I didn't know what I was doing. I knew what I was doing as far as I knew I was a reader, right? And I think we all start there. Maybe we love reading, but applying what you read is just not the same as sort of learning the mechanics of writing, but it's a start, and that's what's most important. And I sat down and I opened a WordPad because that was all we had on my like desktop, at home. And I just started like writing. I remember just describing a place, and it mimicked where I lived, because I lived on 10 acres of land, in the middle of Oklahoma. We were surrounded by trees, and we had a creek in the back. And so that's where I started, is describing what I knew. And then I just kept going, and I had like, I don't know, a ton of pages. I don't even know if I knew where the story was going, but I just started. And I think that was the most important part,
Yeah.
I think we get hung up on like, I got to know where the story is going. But I think that we can get so hung up on like, I have to know where it's going. We never start.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. So from 13 and starting like that, what was your process from there to getting published?
Wow. A lot of years.
Naivety kind of. There was a bit of a road.
It would be about 18 years before I had any success in publishing. And I remember, so I was 13, I was in middle school when I started writing. And I think it was the next year, I think it was the next year I went into my freshman year, and my freshman English teacher introduced me to the junior English teacher, and was like, she wants to be a writer. She's written a whole novel. I'd written several by that point. And I think my junior English teacher, her name was Miss Applegate. And When Stars Come Out, there's a letter dedicated to her. And I think that she was like, okay, like I'll read this book, not really believing anything about it. But what she saw when she read it was potential. And so she fostered my, motivation to become a writer. So with her help, I applied to this writing contest. I wrote this short story, and it was called the Eastern Oklahoma Writing Contest, and I got first place. And that was like, I was like, I can do this. Like, it's validation. Like, I'm on the right path. And I was so ecstatic, but I wouldn't have any successes for like 18 more years after that. It was like, recent, in the last like 3 years was my success as an author. I'm 32 now. So, God, that sounds so long, doesn't it? But it's just funny to think about. So I would continue to write. I told everyone in high school I was going to be a famous author. I just kept writing stories. When Stars Come Out, the book that is going to release in July, like be reissued, it was a book I was working on in high school. It's such a weird.
Sorry, I've lost sound. Oh no, you're back. Don't worry.
Oh, okay. I was like, ugh. I heard it go off, and I think it's because my Bluetooth disconnected weirdly. Let me see if I can. Oh, I just had a whole lost connection with my keyboard. We can edit this out.
That's fine. That's the best thing about pre-records.
I know. Let me see if I can get that reconnected. Can you still hear me though?
Yeah, that's fine. Okay. Yep.
That's my headphones out. Hopefully the quality doesn't suffer without my headphones.
No, that's fine.
So yeah, okay. So I think the thing I did was that every choice I made in high school, in college, and after was with the goal of being a full-time author. Mm-hmm. So for instance, in high school, I was the one who got our creative writing classes started. So, I got people to join that class, and we could create one once we had like 8 kids or something. So I did that for 2 years in high school. And then when I went to college, I majored in English writing. And English writing is nothing like professional writing, but I didn't want to go under journalism. And also they don't really foster that love of fantasy writing. Really, it's like, if you're going to be a literary fiction writer, do that. But it wasn't really for me. And what it did do, I will say, my English degree, and you don't have to have a degree in English to be a writer, but it did help me critically analyze texts. And I think that helps me think very critically about my writing. So even though I do write romance, I do think very critically about the real life, impact of emotion and trauma, and how we haven't changed as a society, and parallels to, history. And so I do think very critically about that. And I think my degree helps me. And then when I went to get my master's degree, I did library science because, I'm like everyone who goes into library science without knowing what it is. I was like, I like books. And it turned into so much more than that. But what it ended up giving me was this ability to be a good manager. And these were all skills that would help me eventually when I was able to become a full-time writer. So throughout all this, college, grad school, I wrote. So in grad school, I had been writing this book about pirates, and I was like, I'm going to publish this. My friend was like, why don't you just self-publish? Like, you keep getting no's, whatever, just do it yourself. And I was like, yes. I was so motivated and so excited because I had been in the writing world online for a while. And I was like, I could do this. I've gathered enough resources, and I did. And it was not good. It was not a good experience. And I think what it taught me, unfortunately, was one, that I wasn't ready, but 2, I had a really bad relationship with my writing. And so I ended up writing the second book and publishing that. And then I just took a break to get better at being an author. And I went to conferences and I joined critique groups and just really started to work on my craft. And I think what actually helped me were books on craft more so than people's feedback. So there was one piece of feedback that I think changed my writing forever. And it was that I needed to layer more emotion into my novel. so now a part of my editing process is a whole process dedicated to expanding on like the emotional elements of my book. But once I just focused on being a better writer, I was like, okay, I'm going to try this again. And that's when I wrote When Stars Come Out. And When Stars Come Out, like, was no great success, but it was a turning point for me. And I can't really explain how. It just was a different process. It wasn't that book had any, it didn't make a splash. Hardly anyone's read it. It's whatever. But it motivated me. It changed the tone of how I had published before. And I was like, I'm going to write A Touch of Darkness. I'm going to write this book, and I did it. And it was, I think what happened is I really embraced what I wanted to write, which was romance. And I'd been so afraid of it for so long because, with the Twilight era, and we got so used to just making fun of young girls who wanted to read love stories. And it makes other authors afraid to do it because, we're going to like be made fun of or be the butt of every joke or something like that. And I was afraid of that. And once I sort of let that fall away and just did what I wanted to do, it was like instant. And A Touch of Darkness, I will say, was not an instant success. It took a year. Like the first year it was out, I made $2,000 and I was ecstatic. That was the most I'd ever made from, being an author. And I remember telling my CPA, was like, we've got to like get a handle on this because next year I'm going to make a lot more. The next year I made like 70K. And then the next year it was like 6 figures, right? Actually, I think it ended up being 7 figures, but see how like the increase was tenfold, right? So yeah, it was almost like when I started to just like release like this pressure or this fear of what I really wanted to write and just do what I had always felt drawn to do. Things were just quick, but I don't think I would have been able to build the bridge to my success without those mistakes, or, they're not even mistakes. They were just laying a foundation, to be better at all of this, at the writing, at the publishing, at the marketing, all of it.
Absolutely. This is such a great story. I love this so much. I've got so many questions from that, but
it's chaotic. So I hope it makes sense. I hope you learned something.
What I want to know is, because I can't even imagine there'd be so many challenging times within that 18 years, especially when you have such a clear vision of what you want. Is that what kept you going? Like, because throughout rejection and constantly learning and bettering yourself, you didn't give up. Like,
yeah, I just knew, I think sometimes I have a very strong connection to like what I feel is my sole purpose. Like at the core of it, I was like, this is what you're meant to do. I always believed that. Like at its core, I couldn't be anything but an author. And I just knew there's very few things in my life like that I don't feel very certain about. Like everything I decide on is something I 110% believe in. And I followed like my intuition every step of the way with this. And I think that there were times when I thought, even now as a successful author, there are times when I'm like, why do you do this? It's like so stressful and so exhausting. And sometimes you feel like there's payoff, but sometimes it's painful too at the same time. But I really just think, that's what kept me going, because I remember getting feedback from a critique partner. I was in college still getting my bachelor's degree, and it was one of my first books. I hadn't yet published it because I didn't publish until my grad years. And she just said like my book was not good. It was like, basically I didn't have an understanding of story structure, I think. And so I read this book called Anatomy of Story by John Truby. And, we fall into two camps. You're either that one or you're Save the Cat. And I have never been able to read Save the Cat, but if Save the Cat helps you, read it. You have to go with what you feel connected to, right? So I read it and I took all these notes and I revised my book. But before I got there, I gave up. Like I piled everything into like the middle of my room. I was ready to just throw it away. But the next day I was like, okay, you just have to start over. And I think you have to just be okay with that. With writing, or just any creative, actually anything in your life, really, you have to be content with where you are in the moment. And I feel like, especially like, I don't live in another country. So I've only ever lived in the United States, but here we are so pressured to be young and successful, and to always like, there's this weird thing, this weird oppressive thing around people where like, you can make it if you just try hard enough, which is not true. It's not, in truth, it is not true at all. But that's our culture, and it's just, it's kind of, it's hard because you feel as an individual living here that, you can't fail. And so yeah, it's one of those things. You just, you keep going. And if this is really what you want to do, I think eventually you will make it. But someone told me one time, like they had to stand in line, and they feel like they when they finally felt like things were working out for them, it's because they had stood in line. And I think all those years, those 18 years, now 19, because I just turned 32, I was standing in line, I was waiting, I was doing the things, and it did pay off. But we don't have to be young and successful. Like I think that the whole point is the journey you take to get here, because it's not going to be rewarding unless you work for it in some, in a lot of ways. Like, how can you value something that you didn't work for? And unfortunately, a lot of people, especially, well, I don't really know. I mean, I think a lot of people in general, especially people of color, have to work 10 times harder to be where, some of us are. And it's hard, especially in any industry. The publishing industry, though, tries to pretend, right, that they don't whitewash everything, and they still whitewash everything. And so, it's one of those things. It's always hard, but it will be worth it in the end, I think. And that's my personal belief. I think you'll get there. It's just it's a whole process. And I wish I had known that 19 years ago. I wish I had known, like, it's okay, like, be content with, you don't have to be 21 like Veronica. I think it was Veronica Roth was 21 when she got published, and we look at those stories and we want to be that exception. But I'm 32 and I'm an exception to all the rules. Literally everything I've been told, I have done the opposite. So you can be any age and still be the exception. It's okay.
I love that. That is so great. I take away so much from that.
I went in so many directions there, but we got there eventually.
That's great. So what would you say has brought, like, when you said a touch of darkness, didn't have the most successful year to start off with, what was it that changed for you? Was it, obviously you've turned it into an incredible series, but what was it that took off your next year?
So A Touch of Darkness has it feels like it's had 3 lifetimes, because there are 3 years where things were kind of odd. It was like the first year it felt successful. I made money off of a book, like $2,000. And then the next year, I think I released Ruin and A Game of Fate. So that year was the year I could quit my job, which was huge. That's huge, right? And I thought, this is like it. I made it, right? In the second year. And then in the third year, it was like beyond my wildest dreams. So by the third year, it had gone viral on TikTok. And I wasn't on TikTok at the time. So that's all readers. And I think throughout that whole part, a lot of it was readers. Now, in the beginning, to sort of lay the foundation for that, I just chose a few social media platforms to be on. And I think I started with this idea that I was going to be genuinely me on social media. So I wasn't going to censor myself, and I don't, which is the weird thing sometimes. I was just going to give my opinion like I do in real life and just be who I am. And so that meant changing my aesthetic and to fit with who I really was. So part of this was like weirdly an identity shift, because I was just becoming who I really wanted to be. And it was easier to do that sort of because I started writing what I wanted to write, romance, right? And then, then when I could quit my job, I could kind of shake off, what you had to be a different sort of, put a different like foot forward as far as professionalism goes when you work for a public entity. So I think part of it was like just deciding to be genuine, sticking with my aesthetic, and then those really focusing on a few social media platforms. And my goal, everyone always says, go where your readers are. And I think that's frustrating advice for people. They're like, where are my readers? But my thought was like, I want a fandom, and where do fandoms live? And at that time, fandoms lived on Pinterest and Tumblr. So I was like, okay, what do people seek when they are, obsessed with something? And it's quotes, right? And fan art. So I could do quotes because I'm an author. So I just made really simple graphics, like black with white text. And I noticed that those did really well on Pinterest, but not so well on Tumblr. But what did well on Tumblr was just the actual quote, no like graphic behind it. So I did that for a really long time. And I put the first 3 chapters, or the first, like actually a lot, on Wattpad to give people the chance to like experience the book. And that's what I did as my marketing for like the first 2 years. And the thing that you learn about marketing is word of mouth marketing is absolutely the #1 way to market. But in order to get word of mouth marketing, you have to have people talking about your story. So that's why I think everything goes back to craft. And is your writing, good enough? People can ignore grammar if they like the story. Now, I'm not saying you should ignore grammar, but good writers are not always good at grammar. I am one of those people. I have a degree in English, and that does not mean I have a degree in grammar. People get those things mixed up all the time. But if people enjoy your story enough, the grammar will come. Like, you will find people to help you. And it's just the reality of being a self-published author. Thankfully, now I have a publisher and an editor, and I'm so glad, because that's not my forte. It's really hard to self-edit anyway. But I think it was just a combination of like all the right things. So yeah, but I think it definitely goes back to craft and having a story, at least at the heart, a good story, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, yeah, if people are getting invested in the story, you're right. Grammar can come after that. So what is your routine now? What is your daily routine when it comes to when it comes to writing?
I have a really bad habit of waiting until the pressure is on and I have like a month left to go, and just like whipping out a book in a month or 2 months. Don't recommend that. Yeah, man, this is really hard for me because I have a really terrible routine. But I think it's because I go based on what I'm doing now. And so what I'm doing right now is really brainstorming. Like earlier, I had a call about like a plot line with my editor because I have to process externally. And I was like, I have this other plot line worked out, but I need to know this one. So I just kind of think through like, what are these things going to look like? What are the scenes? Like, how I start a book is like, what are the scenes I could write now? And I write those down. And so that's kind of the phase I'm in. So until I get out of that, I won't start sitting down and writing like chronologically. But even then, when I sit down and start writing chronologically, I'm so terrible. I don't do a word count goal. My brain doesn't work like that. I have to write when I feel the like push. So I end up writing from like probably like 11 till like 10 at night, and with like some breaks in between. But my work week is like not 40 hours. It's like 100 hours when I'm in that zone. So, I'm hoping that may change at some point because I'll get more structured, but I've been a full-time author for, I don't know how long now, 2 years. I think it's 2 years. And I still have not quite worked that out yet. So we'll see. I don't know. I love writing. So I love like doing the all day writing thing, but I don't think that's feasible long term. But you do have to find what works for you. And honestly, tracking my word count every day does not work for me. So I have to think of something else. Like everyone says, just track your word count. And I'm like, I can't do it. I don't know what it is. So if you have any, if anyone has suggestions that are outside of word count,
I'll put it out there.
Know.
It's interesting though. I think you're right. And you do have to find what specifically works for you, because if you're completely lost in a story, the last thing you want to think about is numbers. Like it's a different side of your brain to think, you know, you're just thinking about getting it done rather than really putting it out there. And I think sometimes when you do have those, like, I don't know, I call them like vomit days where you're just in it for such a long period of time, it's not bad, because if that's what's coming through you and that's how you work the best, you know, that's your structure.
Yeah, so what I find is there are parts of the novel that I write really cleanly and they won't require hardly any editing. And then there are parts of the story that are really bare bones and they require the most editing. And that's kind of how I just do. I'm like, okay, well, I don't really feel the scene right now. So like all the fight scenes in Malice, I skipped. And I just was like, insert fight scene. And I went back later after the book was like, you know, the first draft was done. And then I wrote all the fight scenes, because I just couldn't do it. I wasn't in the headspace to write a fight scene at that point. So I'm definitely like, I'm what I like to call an intuitive writer. I just kind of do what feels right at the time. But like, you know, right now I'm like dreading getting back into it, because I have to write QMM, Queen of Myth and Monsters. And I'm dreading getting back into it because I know what it's going to be all consuming. And I have to travel this month. And I'm like, what are you going to do? So we'll see, but I don't have a good process the most process I have is that's the steps of, you know, writing the scenes that are clearest to me. Once I've written all of those, I start writing chronologically, and then I cannot skip forward. I have to write chronologically from there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
there you go. It's a process.
It is. It's terrible. But one of the things I read, I forget, I was reading Writing Down the Bones, I think that might be by Natalie Goldberg or something. It's the title is definitely Writing Down the Bones, but she talked about how don't try to change your writing process. Just embrace what you do, because that is your process. And if you try to change it, you're just going to frustrate yourself. So once I did that, once I said, like, this is my writing process, it was actually easier to just do it than fight against it. I'm probably fighting against it right now.
It's a lot though when you're about, I know what you mean, that feeling when you're about to sit down and do something, because it takes so much of you that it's like you need to like get ready to, it's all consuming.
Yeah. Great. I isolate myself. I like stop answering calls. I stop answering text messages. And I know that's what I'm about to do.
Locked away for as long as you can until you like re-emerge for it.
I just need like a cabin in the woods where I go to with no internet access. Like that's what I need.
That's the dream. That's a dream. I feel like it'd be very inspiring too. I can't imagine the like stories that you could write out of a place like that.
I know. When I went to Ireland, I stayed in this little, like this really cool place in Wicklow. And it was so magical. And I was like, I want to write a novel here every day. I want to sit in front of this beautiful window and write like a novel here. So hopefully I get to do that like later this year. Would be a dream.
Absolutely. Now you have are you traveling for a new release? Is that what you're traveling for this month?
Yeah, well, so I'm going to France for the release of A Touch of Darkness there. And then I have Imaginarium Book Festival in DC. And then at the end of June is the tour for A Game of Retribution.
Oh, awesome. Excellent. So if you're in any of those places, then you can come and check you out. But if any of the listeners want to get in contact with you, learn more about you, where is the best places to find you?
I'm most active on Instagram, and my handle is author Scarlett St. Clair. I believe sometimes I get isn't it terrible that I get the handle?
You look at your own. It's
yes. Author Scarlett St. Clair. I'm always like, is it Scarlett St. Clair author or is it author Scarlett St. Clair? It's terrible, but we definitely update there, and we do keep my website up to date. So if you're like looking for signed copies or, you know, things like that, like release schedules, it's all on my website, and that's scarlettstclair.com.
Perfect. Excellent. And I'll put it all in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us, Scarlett. That has been the best chat, and you have just given so much goodness to the listeners and very inspiring. So I think everyone that walks away is listening to this is just like pepped up to get into whatever they're working on. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.